What I'm going to do today is different a little bit in that it's really two different lectures instead of one. The first one is what's on the board. The second one, is handouts. Great. So here's handouts. And not only that, I forgot to hand out the reading that's coming up for sometime next week. All right? So the reading that's coming around is from a book called Interaction Ritual Chains by Randall Collins. Those of you in intro, who took intro with me, have been exposed to this whole idea before, so it'll be easier for you. But it's all in there for everybody anyway. I mean, it's a dense version of his argument. It's very closely argued and quite detailed and so on. If you haven't been exposed to it before, don't worry. The lecture next Tuesday, I believe it is, will take care of that. And the intro, people who took intro have heard that lecture once before, but I think you'll find it better than the first time you heard it because you know what's going on already and can get a lot out of it. Anyway, okay, so the two handouts are that reading and the second of the two mini lectures for today. All right? So, mini lecture, questions? Yeah. Yes, it is. And the people who are in Social Theory, and there are what, 6 of you? How many people taking Social Theory also? Wow, do you have a nice week. Okay. In the sense that you read this once for 2 classes. But you'll get 2 different angles on it, I think. We'll see. But yeah, it's one of the many, many benefits of taking more than one course with me. Okay. It's kind of weak. All right. A lot of people, yeah? Oh, yeah. Make sure everybody gets copies of the reading and the handouts. The lecture? Lecture notes? Are there more copies? Oh, yeah. Okay. Gonna keep them all to herself. Know that much more. Okay. How are we doing? Everybody got everything?
So we're going to have a reading.
Cameraman, we'll have to edit, to about here, if that's okay. Thank you. All right, so, a number, good for you. Thank you very much. All right, so, last week various people asked me in various forms, how does this all fit together? Or what does the philosophy stuff have to do with the sociology stuff? Or how do the readings connect to the lectures? Etc. Various forms of this question. So, answer part number 1 is the midterm exam itself should start helping you as you work through it. Start seeing how things connect with everything, so it's a coherent kind of vision. Answer number 2 is what I'm about to do now. All right? So I've said almost all of this before in some form or other. But I haven't tried to put it together in a sequence the way that I've got on the board. So this is not real formally done. I did it in about half an hour, but I think it'll help you some. Okay? So it goes like this. Let's say 7 or 8 steps, moving from kind of the pure individual to society. What we're doing in the course is trying to connect self and society, right? That's why it's called Self in Society. But something more specific than that's happening, which is we're trying to connect the idea of a free individual with the idea of a very predictable and highly institutionalized society. How does that work is kind of the underlying question, right? Yeah, kind of the underlying question. Okay, so there are a number of steps on the way. Step number 1. Gee, it looks like people are free individuals. That is, we feel like we have choices about things. And there's a lot of good evidence that people have choices. People do weird things all the time. People do things like stop eating, voluntarily, or adopt celibacy voluntarily. These are like no food, no sex. Biologically, that doesn't make much sense, right? So we seem to have an ability to overcome what would be the most obvious sorts of constraints on our behavior. Sometimes people do it, right? So there's a good argument that human beings are, to use a philosophical term, are ontologically free. Right? Step 2. But most of the time, people are pretty predictable, certainly in broad patterns at least. So again, the Durkheim example is, famous Durkheim example, is that you can predict with a pretty high degree of accuracy how many people in the state and in this country are going to commit suicide next year, which is pretty odd. You can't name the individuals. That's very hard to do, in fact. But you can give a number that actually comes really, really close to the correct number. And that works pretty often. In other words, in the aggregate, people act in incredibly predictable ways. And even at the micro level, for instance, I could tell you on any given day almost exactly how many people are going to show up for this class, even though I have no idea what's going on in your personal lives. There might be all kinds of good reasons not to show up, but people show up. All right. Number 3, phenomenology as a technique of investigation, let's say, helps us understand how this happens. Okay, so phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the structure of experience, or the structure of consciousness, the forms that our experience takes. And it focuses on looking at how people, not objectively, right, but looking at how people experience things, how they perceive the world is another way of putting it. Perceive is a tricky word here, but how you look at life is another way of thinking of that. Okay, that's kind of what phenomenology does. It tries to look at broad forms. The early examples I gave of that were why something is funny. How is it that you look at life such that certain things make you laugh, or that you find certain people appealing, or things of that sort? How we relate to the world around us is another way of thinking of it. Okay, so phenomenology is just a tool for doing that. All right. So step 4. Well, when we start doing that in social situations, looking at the phenomenology of things, one thing we notice is that people seem to operate in situations. Now, by a situation, I mean when we talk about the definition of the situation, that's the way I'm using it. I'm thinking of the word. But by a situation, I mean what you might think of as a coherent chunk of activity. An example would be a class, a college class like the one you're sitting in right now. That's a chunk of activity. You walk in the room and you recognize there is a college class going on here. And that implies lots and lots of things about what's happening, right? There are several different parts to that notion of a situation. One is that these are relatively coherent chunks of activity. Irving Goffman, in something you're not going to read, refers to them as strips of activity. Like we used to have a strip of film in a movie, a section of it, or a scene, something like that, right? A scene is a good way to think of this, actually. There are scenes, and then there are acts, and then there's a whole play or script. So you might have, well, okay, that's getting off track a little bit. So we have these coherent chunks of activity. Within one of these chunks, we'll call a situation, things seem to fit together. There are a lot of different components. How long it lasts, what space it takes place in, how people behave within that situation, what we might call social roles. So you walk in here and you see, oh, there's somebody talking, everybody else is writing on pieces of paper. Must be a college class. And you recognize the kind of tools we use and the kinds of things that are having a lot of talking going on for some reason. Nobody's hitting anybody. Nobody's tackling anybody. Nobody's playing musical instruments. Okay, it's a class. It's not a music class. It's not a sports practice. You can recognize that because there are all these different parts that seem to fit together. All right? At the same time, another characteristic of situations is that there are alternatives to those situations. It doesn't have to be this way. For instance, you could all be performing a psychology experiment on me, and I'm the stooge. I think it's a college class. I think this is really going well. But you, on the other hand, have been told by Professor McKee or Professor Borton or somebody, take notes. Look like you're interested. We're going to record the whole thing. Then see what he does when one day you do something different. You could do something different. So if you ever walk into a really lousy high school, you'll see a lot of classes that don't really have the right components because the students are all throwing spit wads at each other and horsing around and having sex in the back of the room. And the teacher is just some poor person standing up front going, class, 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 or something like that, right? Maybe she's trying, but it's not going anywhere. But there are all sorts of other possibilities, as we've talked about. Fifth, Irving Goffman points out in his article on face work that people have to work at maintaining the definition of a situation. Things can fall apart all the time. Things do fall apart. So people have to kind of cooperate to keep things going in the direction they're going. Now, one of the amazing, well, there are a lot of amazing things about that, but one of them that you learn by reading a lot of Goffman is that, wow, people, once a situation is up and going, there seems to be a real tendency to give priority to maintaining that situation. That is, there's something about keeping the thing going that people find appealing. Now, we're going to talk about this more next week when we get into interaction rituals in more detail. But another way of thinking of it is that most of us kind of like maintaining our relationships. So if you're in a setting with people and it's going reasonably well, you'll put up with all kinds of stuff in order to keep it going. Specifically, things like people saying things that are outrageously untrue, or that you clearly disagree with even, right? Or that where they're presenting themselves as being utterly unlike what you know they're really like. And you'll oftentimes support that for quite a while because you're just basically trying to keep the thing going. That there's some kind of visceral appeal to human beings of being together with other people. And so you don't want to mess that up. Maybe that's a good way to think of it. That we have a kind of intrinsic or biological bias to getting along with other people. Therefore, once a situation has been defined, people will tend often to maintain it. Number 6, doing that requires the involvement of our physical selves. Or to put it differently, situations are embodied. We're living them physically. You remember when we talked about the nurses and routinization, I said one of the things that was left out of the book, was left out of Beyond Caring, is that nurses are carrying out their work physically. They're doing stuff. They're walking down the hall, going into a room, picking up some equipment, handling it, manipulating it in certain ways, and so on. And those routines are physically habituated. You learn how to do them physically. And that once you learn how to do them physically, you know, you can just get through the day. People say, oh, I go through my day. I can go through and do this in my sleep. That's an expression people use. I can do this in my sleep. Meaning they don't have to think about it at all, much less explicitly. It becomes a physical kind of routine. And Oliver Sacks points out, hey, that's your body doing that. And if your body gets messed up in little funny ways, it can throw the whole thing out of kilter and, in effect, destroy your life as it's been lived up to that point. And then you have to make new accommodations to work with the physical apparatus that you have. Merleau-Ponty is going to talk about, I'm not sure we'll read about this, but he does in other places, talks a lot about this and how our lives are physically based. We're embodied. We don't start from the mind and then do stuff. We do stuff. And then we work the mind in. Okay, now that is, his argument there is derived from Heidegger, who starts off by talking about people hammering, and well, he doesn't start off that way, but it's his big example, is that you can hammer all day and never notice the hammer, because the hammer as an object is something you see later. First, you're just hammering away and doing stuff like that, right? First, we're doing things, then we think about them, right? Merleau-Ponty. Okay, number 7, bad faith, as we've discussed. Okay, now, this particular point, I'm throwing this out as a thought, okay? I'm not offering it as an answer by a long shot, for instance, to your exam question, okay? This is top of my head, so don't, I'm just, okay. Among other things, bad faith is a kind of psychological technique that minimizes our sense of freedom. That is, you got the free individual, I could do anything. They're like, hold on, that might not be a good idea, says something in the back of our mind. I have to do what I'm doing. This is my job. Okay? I can't do it. I'm sorry. Boy, I wish I could go out with you, but I got to study. I've got to do this, or I have to do that, is a kind of way that we have of imposing on ourselves these constraints about continuing to do the things that we've been doing, or staying on some path, or something of that sort. Peter Berger, we read the book near the end of the semester, Berger and Luckman, Social Construction of Reality. Berger uses the idea of bad faith almost exclusively in this way. In other words, he talks about bad faith as being the way that people gear into institutions, that they plug themselves into a spot and follow out their predictable kind of roles. They take a job, or say, well, I'm a mother, and now that I'm a mother, I'm going to do this and this and this, because that's what mothers do. So bad faith is a psychological mechanism that phenomenologists, Jean-Paul Sartre specifically, discovered. It says, wow, this is a really interesting way that people have of shrinking their freedom and fitting into ongoing patterns in a society. The waiter being the great example there. Okay? How to get along with other people and maintain things in a predictable kind of way without being disruptive and so on. All right. Number 8. That brings us to the institutionalization of all this. In other words, there are these situations and they're nested. So here's a class, and this class exists within your day at Hamilton College, which consists of a whole bunch of classes and all sorts of other things, right? And you recognize that the class fits within, say, your academic work, which fits within your weekly schedule, which fits within Hamilton College, which fits within your life, right? And there are all these, I don't know the right way to portray it, kind of nested situations that get down to an individual segment of behavior like what we're doing right now. And if you asked a question or I asked you a question, we'd have a little exchange and you write, oh, conversation within a class, right? And all of that then gets built up into huge institutions that rely on everybody doing kind of predictable stuff for the reasons we've described. The willingness to maintain situations you don't particularly like, the way that bad faith minimizes people's sense of freedom, the way that the body physically habituates you to doing certain things, and so on. How are we doing? Fitting together a little bit? Fitting together better. Good, good, good. Okay, great. Great. It gets better. All right? So next week we'll start talking about interaction rituals and Collins' whole theory of ritual solidarity. And suddenly the social world will open like a flower before you. And everything will make sense. It's phenomenal. It's a great idea. It covers a lot of ground real fast. Okay? Pause. Any questions so far? Okay. Then, deep breath, pause. And now, for something pretty similar. Actually, it's not totally different at all. Something fairly similar, but it's specific to one thinker. Okay? And I'm debating in my mind, and I'd be happy to hear input from people along the way, whether or not to use some more of Merleau-Ponty's work that's way harder than the thing I handed out to you. But it's great stuff. So, you know, we'll talk about this and let me know what you think. We might have a couple of days that are open later in the semester. But it's, you know, it's on the philosophy end of the discussion, not the sociology end. So that's an open thing. Okay. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little about Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Not personally, because personally he wasn't that interesting, apparently. And he died young, alas. He was like 56 or something. Now, some people have said that the great tragedy of French philosophy in the 20th century was that Maurice Merleau-Ponty died young, and Jean-Paul Sartre didn't. But that was an unkind comment on the part of whoever said it, because Sartre went off in some very odd directions. But Merleau-Ponty was good. He follows very much in the tradition we've been talking about. That is, there was Edmund Husserl, who kind of invented phenomenology in 1900, ballpark. He was really a mathematician, Husserl was. And then his student was a guy named Martin Heidegger, who wrote a book in 1927 called Being and Time that's unbelievably difficult to read. But he had some really, really good ideas. And then he became a Nazi. And, well, you know, didn't work out well. But I mean, I shouldn't be flippant about it because there's a serious story in there. But we're not dealing with that. Okay. So, but in 1927, he wrote this really important book. He then had followers. I mean, they weren't his students in our sense, but followers, who included Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who were Frenchmen, who were a bit younger than Heidegger, and they did their work mostly in the 1930s, 1940s. All right? And they were existential phenomenologists, might be the term that gets used. Okay. So, Merleau-Ponty had one important difference from Sartre, which was he was empirically grounded. That is, he studied Gestalt psychology a lot. And he wanted to make his philosophical arguments mesh with the findings of psychology. Okay? So he wasn't just talking logic or ideas or observations he made in a cafe like Sartre, right? He was saying, wait, does this really fit with what we know about human psychology and developments in that? So that's somewhat different. But what that means is that his book, Phenomenology of Perception, which is what I'm thinking we might read an excerpt from at some point, well, the way, when I was in graduate school and I was reading this stuff, I went to my professor, who was a guy named Maurice Natanson, and I said, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, Sartre's book, Being and Nothingness, that you read some from, right? Bad Faith. And Merleau-Ponty. You read them, and they were written at roughly the same time, and they're on pretty much the same topic. And these guys were pals. You know, they cite each other and stuff. But the difference is, Sartre's book, I said, Sartre's book is a manifesto. He's just declaring this is the way it is. Where Merleau-Ponty's was an argument. Merleau-Ponty tries to go through things step by step and take the arguments against his position and explain why his answer is better and so on. And again, he uses experimental psychology, among other things, to support his claims. So I thought, in that sense, it's a better book. It's a way better book, just my view. Okay. But Sartre was more influential because he was a famous novelist and stuff. All right. Merleau-Ponty makes a number of big points here that are, okay, I'm going to run through them for you. Number one, he says, and we started the course this way, we, human beings, have direct access to consciousness. That is, we know what we're thinking. Thinking's not quite the right word. We know what we're perceiving, what we're experiencing. Example I gave right at the outset was, when something's funny, you know it. That is, you know what makes it funny. I don't mean you know it explicitly like you could write it down, but funny is right there. You're it. In the same way you know sad. When you're sad, you're there. There's no distance between you and the sadness. It's not like sadness is something you picked up somewhere and added on. You're it. All right? So it's not like studying biology where you have to go and look at a frog and cut it apart and learn about it. You can learn about it by sitting quietly and paying attention to yourself, which is kind of neat. Now, it's not that we know these things, again, in what a philosopher would call a thematic way or a predicative way. In other words, it's not that you're explicitly paying attention to what makes something funny. I mean, when you hear a joke, aha, you're just in it, right? And in fact, if you start paying attention to it, it'll stop being funny. That's weird. That's weird, but very important, right? Right? In other words, part of the characteristic of perception, Merleau-Ponty would say, about our immediate experience, is that it's not paying attention to itself. You can't. Right? You're in it. You're living it. So we're living funny or attractive or interesting or sad. We're living those things unselfconsciously is the way we would usually say that. All right? Okay. It's a pre-predicative experience. It's something before stating it in a sentence. It's something that happens before writing rules about how that's done. Very difficult to nail down that kind of stuff. Because again, it's intrinsic to its very nature that you're not paying attention to it. That's how it works. You know, the same way that it's very hard to play the piano well if you're thinking about what your fingers are doing. Wait a minute. Whoa. How does that work? You have to just live it for it to work well. So making it thematic turns out to be quite difficult. But the knowledge, again, is right there. You're doing it. Okay. Very difficult to analyze the obvious is another way of thinking of it. Very difficult. So people like Irving Goffman are geniuses. What's he doing? All he's doing is talking about the stuff we're doing every day. There's nothing Goffman discovers that isn't obvious once it's discovered. But it wasn't. Right? Now, that, interestingly enough, that's the nature of a lot of great sociology, but we'll move on. All right. Number two. So number one is we have direct access to consciousness. Number two, we start out, Merleau-Ponty would say, we start out in the world. All right? The way I said the first day is I live in a meaningful world. That's right off the bat. There's no entering that world. We're there at the outset. Now, this idea, this is big. What that means is, for instance, I'm sitting here at a table talking to you, and I've got notes, and I've got a cup, and I got a pen, and I got glasses. But I was already with those things before I talked about it. Okay? I had to stop and think, oh, what's the table, notes, pen, so the objects in the world, in a sense, are created after I've been living. The world is not put together of objects. First, you're living. You're doing stuff, unselfconsciously, with everything around you. And you're using those things for your own purposes. So from the beginning, a cup has a meaning. It doesn't exist so much as a discrete, topologically interesting thing out here. It's something for this. And when I walk around, that's the way I approach everything in the world. You walked into the classroom today and you opened the door. Can you remember what the handle of the door looks like? Well, maybe now if you glance over that way. But not before. But you did it. You're using that handle all the time. You're using the door handle before you ever have a concept of it as an object. You're just living. Right? Now this way of thinking about things comes from Heidegger. And he says the whole physicalistic notion of objects in the world that get together is wrong. First, we're living. First, we're doing stuff. Then we stop, and if you want to have a philosophy course, you can separate objects off. Or there's some breakdown. The door handle doesn't work, and suddenly, what's wrong with it? Jeepers, how did they make this thing? Then you start paying attention to it as an object. But up until then, it's just part of your coping in the world. You're doing stuff, right? Which is quite magical. And everything is like that for Merleau-Ponty. Mountains, for instance, we say, that's a big mountain. Well, what does that mean? Big. Certainly not compared to traveling to Jupiter. Right? But traveling to Jupiter is something we could sort of imaginarily do. And so we think, well, for that purpose, the mountain is small. For normal purposes, like I want to walk up to the top of it, geez, that's a big mountain. In other words, everything is related to our own bodies. All sorts of objects in the world are related to our own abilities to do things physically. All right? Okay. So we see everything around us then in terms of our own purposes. Maybe that's another way to put it. But see isn't quite right. It's more like feel. You're just subconsciously aware of it. Right? That's why there's artwork that consists of a chair with a bunch of spikes sticking up through the seat, and you go, ooh. Because every time you see a chair, you automatically think of sitting on it. Okay? You don't think of sitting on it like, I think I'll sit like that. But if one of these chairs in here had a bunch of spikes sticking up, you go, arr! In other words, your body thinks about sitting on the chair. Right? Automatically. That's just what we do with everything. The shapes of things, we imagine ourselves fitting into them, or fitting into the meaning, moving around them, and so on. Okay? All right. Now that reality is given at the outset. It's not like, René Descartes. I don't know. Have we talked about this before? Cogito ergo sum, that sort of business. Did that come up? So Descartes, who was a French philosopher and mathematician, Cartesian coordinates, right? Yeah, everybody took algebra, geometry a little bit. Cartesian, he came up with that too. Smart guy. Very smart guy. So he said, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, because everybody spoke Latin, right? I mean, everybody educated. He said, I think, therefore I am. In other words, what happened is he sat down in a chair, basically, and he thought, and he said, what do I really, really, really know for sure? I don't know about other people. I don't know about the external world. What I know for sure is that I'm thinking. Okay? This is a huge breakthrough in philosophy, defining moment in the history of epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Cogito ergo sum. Everybody, oh my God, the guy's a genius. He was. Merleau-Ponty says, hey, wait a minute. Descartes got up in the morning and ate breakfast and then went and sat in his chair. First, he ate breakfast. Okay? Nobody had to prove to him that his Cheerios were sitting there. I mean, not Cheerios, but you get the idea, right? In other words, he was living. What's the proof we need here? And it's fine to, sit in a chair and think philosophical thoughts, but let's recognize that people are doing stuff way before they do philosophy. And Merleau-Ponty would say, that's what you really ought to start with, not the stuff that some highly intelligent specialist mathematician comes up with one day, in the 18th century. Okay. Final point about starting from the world, starting from living in the world. It's a shared world. Again, in the nurse article that we read, we talked about routinization and so on. And what was left out of that article, my bad, was they are stepping into ongoing routines that other people have already been into. They're entering a shared world. Other people are already doing those things. That's a huge factor. And it's what makes much of life possible. I think we talked about learning French. I gave you that example. So you want to learn French, there are multiple ways of doing it. One, you could buy a book and study French. Good luck. I did German that way. I could passably read half a newspaper at one point many years ago. Okay, 2, Rosetta Stone. That'd be great. But the real way to learn French? Go to France. Best way to learn French? Be born in France. Okay? I could show you some dirt stupid 5-year-olds in France. Every one of them can speak French. You don't have to know, there's no language gift. People say, oh, I'm not good at languages. No, you were just born in the wrong country. Right? In other words, if you're born into routines surrounded by other people doing stuff, you'll pick those up. That's the way most of our lives are worked. Okay? So, and Merleau-Ponty recognized that. Most of our worlds, in the sense of lived worlds, we're not talking the physical universe, right? They're shared. They're shared. We work together with other people all the time. That's fundamental. And for sociology, that's really fundamental. Number 3. Now, for Merleau-Ponty, then, freedom, in the Sartrean sort of way, is not really Sartrean. It's contentful. In other words, it's full of stuff all the time. There's no such thing as just kind of a wide open freedom for Merleau-Ponty. For Sartre, freedom is relatively unencumbered. That is, it can kind of go in all sorts of directions. You could do all sorts of different things. But Merleau-Ponty sees freedom as entirely in the world. That is, it's tied to stuff. Primarily our own body. You can only do things your body can do, and it has limitations and so on. So Sartre was right when he said we're condemned to be free. It's a inescapable situation because of our physical location. All right? All right. Freedom doesn't mean then that you're unattached or uncommitted. You're always committed to something. The only question is what. All right? So if you try to change what you're doing, you can do something different. But there's no option to do nothing. We've talked about that before. Number 5. All right. Our decisions are not, boy, a lot of these things, they're hard to get because the words are wrong. Our decisions to do, how are we doing? Let me pause here. Question?
We're 3 and 4 at the part number 4 kind of. Like,
yeah, they kind of got blurred together.
Checking.
Yeah. I didn't have much to say about 4.
That's fine.
That's all right. All right, questions. Dan, did you have a question? say there are, anybody? Okay, all right. Number 5 here on the sheet. Decisions, when we make them, are not always, not even typically, conscious or deliberate, or, I mean, the word decision, even in this context, is tricky. I mean, you remember when we talked about Sartre's existentialism article, we were talking about you choose to do, like you choose to be sad, for instance, or you choose to be angry, and people are like, oh, you don't really choose. You know. Well, it hangs on the idea of what choose means. He doesn't mean, and this is true for both of them, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, when they talk about choosing, it's not that you always have the chance to sit quietly and measure out the options and then pick one. You're just choosing automatically all the time to do different stuff. And you're really choosing, but it's not necessarily or even usually a conscious, deliberate decision. Not at all. So my example I've got here. So I gave a talk a few days ago to a bunch of parents. It was great. And Hamilton parents of current students. And so I'm talking to some people, and they said, how long you been here? 32 years, I answer. And they go, ooh. And they say, almost without fail, you know what they say? You must really like it. That's what they say. Okay. It doesn't follow. It's not a good logical deduction. All right? You've been here 32 years. You must really like it. I said, no. And usually I say, oh, I do. I love it. You know, that's the better answer. But sometimes, if I'm being a wise guy, I'll go, well, actually, that doesn't follow logically. Because what happened was not that in 1981, I came here and said, I think I'll spend 32 years at Hamilton. Yes? Well, let me think about this. Okay. That's not what happened. What happened is I needed a job. And this was a good one, right? And it was better than the alternatives. So I showed up. And then a couple of years later, somebody said, would you like this other job? And I thought about it, and I go, well, let me. At that point, I made a decision. Right? And then there were several other points where people came along and said, would you like to do this other thing? And each time, Hamilton looked better than the alternative. Here I am, 32 years later. Right? So it's not as if there was one decision that led to 32 years. Same way getting married. You know, if you're married to somebody for 50 years, people, oh, they must be so in love. Oh, not necessarily. I've known some old people who've been married a long time, hated each other. It's just that at each moment, the question, is it better to stay married or get divorced or whatever, they always came down on one side. Okay, that's a decision of sorts, right? But it's not like a conscious sit down one time, let's commit sort of thing that locks it in. You've had it every day, in effect, you're sticking around instead of hopping on a bus and heading to Kansas. All right? So decisions often are implicit in our living. They're not cognitive sort of enterprises. Okay. Now, it may be, some people pointed this out a week or two ago, talking about bad faith. You can start making decisions, you do, in fact, quite early in your life. Like when you're a baby, somebody picks you up. Do you laugh? Do you smile? Do you scream? And that can be a habit, right, that you start doing. That's just what you do when people pick you up. Next thing you know, you're 30 years old and wonder why you don't have friends. Right? That it can be that sort of thing where you habitually start down a path and that's the way you always respond. And changing those habits can be quite difficult because, again, they become physically habitual. A certain person walks in the room and you smile. And you don't have to think about it. You don't say, oh, there's Jose. Oh, hey, and this kind of thing. You don't have to think about it. It just happens. And so you go down these tracks. Those are existential decisions at some level, right? That is, some of those, usually the word is meant to mean big life decisions, existential, like who am I going to be kinds of things. But they can be embodied. They can be just in your living. You've chosen to go in a certain way. And the term that Sartre likes using for this, that Merleau-Ponty uses occasionally, is you wind up with what they call an existential project. That is, there's a direction to your life. There are habitual ways in which you do things that, in effect, declare a kind of purpose. And your purpose might be, you know, to always modify yourself to what to what the people around you like. Maybe you're just real compliant. That's what you do. Or you're trying to always please your parents, is an example I think I've given before. Or you like being rebellious, and no matter what situation comes up, you're going to be rebellious because that's just who you are. I have some colleagues at Hamilton who are like that. I won't name names, but that's just what they do. And at first you think, wow, boy, that person's really, you know, sticking up for what they believe. And then after a while, no, that person they just like sticking up. I mean, they're not, you know, it has nothing to do with principle. It's just they got to be rebellious. I don't know, right? Or please so and so, or whatnot. So that can be an existential project. All right, number 7 for Merleau-Ponty. This is a big one. Differentiates him from Sartre really. Is there's this inertia then to our choices. Sartre, you read him, and it's like at every minute you could head off in some totally new direction. Well, you know, theoretically, I suppose that's true. Like every so often it happens that you go off in some weird new angle. But mostly, that's not a very helpful way of thinking about people, because mostly people don't do it. The way I formulate this is the best prediction, the best indicator of how a person is going to act is how that person's always acted. Ask me what I've learned from social science in 30, 40 years. That's about it, you know. It's like, oh, that's not the only thing. But well, I mean, the big one is best predictor of how a person's going to act is how that person's always acted. This really, really works. Just because somebody says, oh, no, really, really, baby, I swear I've changed. It's all going to be different from now on. Don't believe it. I mean, it might, but probably not. The other thing I've learned from social science is that the most important thing in your life is who are the other people around you. That really works. Anyway, that's a side topic. Okay, so Merleau-Ponty says there's a kind of inertia to our choices, which we might think of as habits or personality or patterns of behavior or something like that. That stuff is embodied. For instance, my wife walks in the room and sees the cat, who's no longer with us, right? Who's down at our daughter's house. She physically, it's like her vision, it didn't project a cat. There was a slipper on the floor, right? And the way she looked at the world anticipated a cat being there. Right? By the same token, you see somebody you don't like and you kind of go, and it's unself-conscious, it's automatic. Or you smile when you see a friend or whatnot. Or you habitually finish an exchange with another person. How are you doing? Hey, I'm fine. How are you? I'm bad. Oh, great. See you tomorrow. Wait. Something felt wrong. Because you're used to just following out these trains of thought, and it's almost physically embedded. Or you accidentally call somebody by the wrong name because they're in a role that you're used to someone else having. Oh, this can be embarrassing. All right. All right? You're like, hey. Example might be every once in a blue moon, I'll start in talking to my wife. I'll start to say, "Mom." Hey, you know this? How's this happen?
Well, it's like you call your teacher mom or dad.
Yeah. Because there's something about the interchange that's going that way, and then you say, "Oh," you're kind of real embarrassed. It's just that's the way we operate. You know, we're physically embodied or involved in these routines, and if one person takes one role, the other person takes the other role. And it's hard to break out. It's very hard to play a role that doesn't fit in with the other person. Okay. And finally is that these habits are cultural. That is, they're done by entire groups of people. There are entire societies that are proud or deferential or humble or loud or whatever, right? Just entire, hundreds of millions of people, literally, all acting in roughly similar ways that are physically embodied. Now, Merleau-Ponty says these patterns have, he says, a certain weight. Weight, W-E-I-G-H-T. That is, yeah, theoretically, we're all free. But really, you can't just go off in a new direction. It's very hard to do. And his criticism of Sartre, famous line, he says, Sartre ignores the weight of history. Sartre ignores the weight of history. And you've got to take that into account when you're talking about freedom in human affairs. The weight of history. Now, how that works is a little trickier, but that's what we've been talking about, this sort of physical habits, the power of situations, the power of trying to conform with other people for good reasons, that sort of business. Okie dokes? All right. Are there any questions? Questions, reactions? I know everybody's tired this time of the semester. Appreciate your bearing with. Okay? All right. Good luck on the exam. I'm looking forward to seeing you.